Welcome to the third of 8 videos from the Roman Army Lecture 2021 UofW on appearance, identity, and so on. So here we are to talk a little bit about how we know what the soldiers wear, what sort of equipment they had. And so this is actually broken down into a couple of videos where we'll look at the depictions of soldiers in the early and high imperial eras, and then late antiquity, and then look at some individual depictions. Okay, but we're going to start off with just some general points and the early and high imperial era. Okay. Right, so the image of the army, depictions of soldiers. So how can we determine what they look like? What are important points? What is unimportant? Does it matter if we know what they look like? Obviously, it matters to some degree or other, partly just from interest. But we do actually have a wide range of depictions of soldiers. So a lot of public art depicts them. You can see them in arches and columns and frescoes. And I'll show you some examples of lots of these. We have funerary art, which is another important source. So tombstones, which will come at the end when I talk about individual depictions. We have sarcophagi, some sort of high plus Imperial Era battle sarcophagi. And then we have like figurines. If I was quicker, I could show you one on my phone from the British Museum. Coins, and then helmets sometimes depict things, mosaics, and so forth. So for the early Imperial Era, we haven't got it. We haven't got a lot of visual depictions. Okay, here is a marble cinerary urn from the Met in New York. Okay, this dates to the first half of the 1st century CE. It's marble. So you can see, the curved scutum, but you also see some oval ones and, some armor and hints of some greaves. So it's a whole collection of equipment all kind of jumbled together, which is maybe not unlike some of the stuff that my friends here are wearing, okay, to some degree, but, they don't also have greaves because who knows why. So, but really we sort of move a bit later to get some better depictions. And of course, there's none of the color that probably would have initially been on this, which is, unfortunate. Usually seem to be the best evidence for us, at least in the early and high imperial era, for the image of soldiers is the column of Trajan. Okay, Trajan, Dacian War emperor, famous for lots of things. So here's a plan of his forum, all sorts of stuff he paid for because of the Dacian Wars. And there was a column and possibly libraries and a market and all sorts of stuff connected to him. Here's much of what is left today, and there you can see the column no longer surrounded by all these things, but you get hints of the scope of this with the columns. This is one of our most important sources. Here's a reconstruction of what it maybe could have looked like with the libraries and the column in the middle, basilica and temple sort of all around it, which might have given you some ability to see this column. Here it is reconstructed in color, and it really kind of pops as you look at it with people surrounding the buildings looking up. Now, the column, of course, tells this narrative story of the Dacian Wars of Trajan, the first one, the second one, beginning from setting off here, working all the way up. And it includes, dates to 113, before the end of Trajan's life. It includes, of course, many different kinds of soldiers in it. So in this scene in particular, and I think we talked about this with sources, you can see various barbarian groups, the Dacians. This is from National Geographic. They're the ones, in the inferior position on the scene in the visual plane. Okay, wearing trousers and long sleeve clothing and whatever. The kinds of things that I said the late empire became associated with Roman soldiers, which is another issue. You can see they're wearing the little hats and the spears and the oval shields, which people say marks these guys out as auxiliaries. So that's a complicated issue. We're waiting more work from John Coulston on this. Here, of course, the images we see here are different from what we see in some other monuments, like the Adam Clissi monument that we've talked about as well. But also Trajan's column, it's not just these auxiliaries, of course, or these possible auxiliaries. It's also possibly these legionary soldiers wearing the segmented armor, more like, this dude who looks slightly more the common. And you can see the curved scuta and so on, hints of the segmented armor here. Okay. The Adam Clissi one, of course, as I said, takes a slightly different approach. Okay, there is a close-up. You see a bit of the bottom bits of the tunic here, which I don't have in any of my soldier dudes, but you sometimes find on works of art. But it's different artistic practices and so on. Okay, we have, let me just double check what I have here, right? Another important period of artistic evidence for this comes from the reign of Marcus Aurelius and so on, and even Antonine Pius before that. So we have a column base where we see a bit more of these. Obviously, I'm not getting into some of the technical details of the art. And people would say the figures depicted on here are slightly less realistic. Okay. So 3D, they stand out. The proportions are slightly off, the heads, the bodies, but they were still wearing some of the same typical things. So these are soldiers in the middle, and they have some of these standards, and some of them have the hats with the plumes, which I can't show you here, and I have, a model one. We have some stuff on campus I could have shown you, but you do see the segmented armor, okay? You can see right here, and greaves, hints of that too, and rest of the tunic, but you can see the officers of the plume have more of the all-in-one sort of breastplate, and you see some of their shields are more oval shaped than the rectangular scoot. So this is only a few decades after the column of Trajan, so you see, what are we seeing? Are these differences, or are they something else? Anyway, and then here are some more Marcus Aurelius era materials, but with for the column of Arch of Constantine, and you can see the tunic and the all-in-one breastplate for obviously generals, but you also see some of the chainmail, as I showed you in this dude here, okay, depicted on these Roman soldiers. And then also, of course, there's facial hair issues, which I won't get into yet, with barbarians down below. Marcus Aurelius' column, something else, includes both, so we get more sort of chainmail, and some plumed helmets and oval shields and a lot of swords and stuff. So we see less actually of the segmented armor, a bit hints of it here, and again changes in facial hair and whatever. But you do then see them in other places, or these guys, a bit like the column of Trajan, where they're looking up at Marcus Aurelius giving a speech. So it could be that these are more representative of the kinds of things that Napoleon might have worn, assuming these are legionary images. And I said also we find things on sarcophagi, but there's some instruments like here and various barbarians being trampled and some general dude in the middle. But it could be that these are all just higher ranking soldiers with more plumed helmets, but some of their helmets almost look kinds of things we might expect maybe with possibly from earlier historical periods. But so they're one of the main issues, just to finish off this video. So we have a lot of this visual sculptural evidence, okay, which tells us a lot about what soldiers looked like, but they maybe in many respects tell us more about what the people who made them thought Roman soldiers looked like. So without other comparative material, it's tempted to argue, and some people have made the case, that, for instance, these soldiers back here on the column of Trajan, so the usual distinction is, these are the auxiliary soldiers, as I said, and then you get some of the legionary soldiers here, but some say, well, maybe these are actually a better representation of the Praetorian soldiers, and we don't know how many of these might have been legionary ones. In part, again, the people who made the art may have only been exposed to Praetorian guards in their day-to-day existence, so they might have been influenced by this in making the pieces. And this is just to raise some of the questions and say that it's not a straightforward case of looking at what we find on these and saying, oh yes, and then we can see it change over time depending on where we go. Okay, so this is some of the visual evidence, sculptural evidence for what soldiers looked like.